My name is Matt Skinner, and I am the Scholar for Adult Education at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis. This is another installment of our series called Big Questions for a Changing Church. What we're doing is once a week during the summer of 2020, inviting in a different theologian and acknowledging the fact that both the COVID-19 pandemic and a renewed imperative to combat systemic racism are changing how we perceive God, how we understand the church, how we make sense of our work in the world as Christians. And so we are inviting people in to get their perspectives from their expertise and their experience about the ways that congregations can be changing creatively, thinking differently, nourishing themselves spiritually, and accompanying their neighbors generously. Today, I am really excited to welcome the Reverend Dr. David D. Daniels III. He serves as the Henry Winters Luce Professor of World Christianity at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. He has served at that school since 1987. He has as well been active in a variety of scholarly and ecclesial or church conversations, including the Reformed and Pentecostal International Dialogue, the Faith and Order Commission of the National Council of Churches, and the World Council of Churches Consultation on Pentecostalism. He's a member of the American Academy of Religion and the former president of the Society for Pentecostal Studies. And if you're not busy enough, David, you're also an ordained minister in the Church of God in Christ. So a strong connection, I assume, between your scholarly interests and your pastoral interests and the way those work together. But thank you for joining me, and by extension, the internet today. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my honor to be with you and to be with Westminster.
Good, good. Let's jump right in. Your training primarily is as a church historian, right? And you have a global perspective on that. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I've been part of an emerging discipline that began to take shape probably late 80s, clearly early 90s, called world Christianity. And my goal and participation in that is to look at how Christianity is shaped in new ways. And what I mean by that, it's not merely how Europe impacted the churches and around the world, but how did Christianity in Africa impact Christianity in Europe, say in the 16th century? That is a probing question of mine.
So you go at it from an international point of view, and which is odd, I think, for a lot of Americans, at least for me, who kind of assume that Christianity is this Western religion. We often talk about it, contrasting it to the Far East, but it's been a global religion for a long time, a multi-continent religion since the first century.
Yes, and what's amazing to me as I read others and probe more into the material is that leaders in the 1400s, 1500s were aware of the church on other continents. I mean, they were not parochial in their vision. In a sense, they had a global sense of the church. Matter of fact, that's where the concept of Christendom often was used, was this church that was global, church that was universal. And they saw that and understood it in that kind of way, which is different than often what happens within the West, where, or at least in North America, where we tend to be very parochial. We only think of the church from our vantage point.
So what does that do then for your own approach to thinking about the churches that we inhabit right now in 21st century America? Are there things that you see from your perspective that fuel our imagination for understanding the issues that we're confronted with now, particularly racism and the church's own complicity in systemic racism over the decades, centuries? What do you see from where you sit?
Well, I love the phrase that you used, our historical imagination. I believe one of the challenges for parishioners and for ministry is that the church lacks an imagination of what the church and society could be like in North America beyond the system of modern racism. We think that modern racism has been with us always and will be with us always. And one of the things I do as a historian is that we also try to not to read into the past, the present, but we try to read as we read into the past, we try to say, how might the past be different than where we are now, which might give us a sense of how things have changed. And so one of the things I think that the study of world Christianity shows is that one might get the sense that sometime in the 1600s, clearly by 1700, is the erection of a system that we would now call modern racism. That this system, which sought to subjugate Africans and then other people of color through the European colonization of the world, especially as it moves beyond Spain and Portugal, includes other European nations, and then the partition of Africa itself through colonialization in 1880s. That the system that emerges and gives support for that kind of imperialism and brand of Christianity is emerging in this late 1600s by 1700s. And when it does, it brings together a collusion of capitalism that is supporting chattel slavery, perpetual slavery. The child born of any enslaved woman will be a slave. Brings together philosophy that there's this hierarchy of races, some superior races and inferior races, or sometimes some adult races and some childlike races, people who are close to nature, therefore they're hunters and gatherers, versus people who build civilization. All of that kind of discussion, which then reinforced this power struggle to control the world, then has scientific expressions with sort of pseudoscience around racism, and then theological expressions. Or some people that are descendants of Noah, or some of them ordained by God to serve the others. Curse of Ham is a way that that has been described. And that comes together, at least in my reading, and a group of other scholars, not the majority, sometimes around late 1600s, early 1700s, and then it's in full bloom by the time you get to the 1800s. So as an historian, then the big question is, what was the church like prior to that? If modern racism is the subjugating of peoples, racializing of peoples, denigrating of certain peoples as being inferior because of the color of their skin, then what is the Christian world like prior to the late 1600s? And how is it different? And what do we see? And so that's the kind of questions that I want to ask, because then if we get a better sense of what the world might be like prior to modern racism, it might be able to fuel our imagination and our ministries and our theologies, as well as our Christian practices of what the world could be like after modern racism.
I've got two questions and they're really different. I'm trying to figure out which one to ask first, but I think I want to ask the historical one then. So would you say that the church, I know this is an impossible generalization, the church, but so was the church of the 12th century, 13th century not racist then by that definition, or?
So I love your question. I love your question. So first of all, by the 1300s, Europeans were meeting Christians from other parts of the Christian world, especially in Jerusalem. That Jerusalem by the 1300s had chapels that Ethiopians had their liturgy and were responsible for. Some people who were Arabs, other Asians were there, and that's where they met. And there are stories that come about these Christians of various colors. But they see them as Christians. They don't see inferior or superior, but they see them as Christians of different colors. The other thing that happens in this period is that there is the realization, which was accurate, that there is a Christian world on the other side of the Muslim divide. And the Muslim divide, especially by the time you get to the 1400s, is one where the Ottoman Empire is within the southern part of the Mediterranean. And then by the time you get to the early 1500s, it's in South Eastern Europe, Greece, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and that part of South Eastern Europe. And so therefore, the Europeans knew that part of the world then, for them, Christian world, on one hand, stopped right where the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim world began. And the Muslim world also moved over to North Africa, and then it moved into dominating parts of West Asia, where Turkey and Syria and Iraq and Iran are today, even though there are Christian minorities in those communities. But then they knew that on the other, to the south end, there was a country called Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was known to them as being a Christian empire of various kingdoms that had a pious king, a strong army, and a lot of wealth. And the reason why they knew it had to have a strong army is because the Europeans could not ever in this period not have part of its continent controlled by Muslims. So either it was the southwestern part, where Spain and Portugal are, or it was the southeastern part, where Greece, Romania, Bulgaria are. They were never, ever, over a 1,000-year period, I believe, to have the European continent not have a part of it under Muslim control. And so what is this empire on the other side that is able to sustain and survive without the support of Europeans? And then they heard it was a pious place, and then they thought that the history of that church goes all the way back to Acts. And as in the story of Acts chapter 8, there's the conversion of the Ethiopian chamberlain or treasurer. Some call him the Ethiopian eunuch. And so they see it as an historic church, but not only an historic church, whose ancestry they thought preceded much of Europe, but one that had a mighty army and that was wealthy and was also pious. And what you'll have is obviously a mixture between real history, super history, you could call it, or legend or myth around this great place. And so there was this respect then for these, what we would now call Christians of color, because of the fact of the way that they were able to live within the world and to be able to survive without European help. Now, the next part, though, is one, unfortunately, gets kind of militaristic. So then they thought, clearly by the 1400s, if we could have an alliance between the church in Europe and the church in Ethiopia, we could be able to conquer the Muslim world and recapture Jerusalem, the holy city of many religions, but clearly a holy city for the Christian world. The second part, in addition to this military alliance, they were hoping that their Ethiopian Christian sisters and brothers could loan them or give them or share with them some of their wealth, because they knew about the gold and other things in Ethiopia. And so, and this is, of course, before the Industrial Revolution, before Europe is able to move into the kind of economy that does make it a very robust place. So they were looking for places for wealth, and they were hoping that maybe their Ethiopian Christian brothers would help them out some. So that's a totally different perception of Africa. It is not one that Africa needs Europe. It's one that Europe needs Africa. It's not one that Ethiopians need Europeans to come to Christianize it. It's one where they recognize each other as Christians, and that the history of the church in Ethiopia is older than Christianity, at least within Northern Europe, Russia, and some other parts of Europe. And so there was an awareness. And this awareness was in some of the church fathers and church mothers and other documents that was there. But again, they weren't able to test that history out until you get to a little later.
So the European, from a European point of view, they knew these Ethiopian Christian communities, churches existed. They respected them. They maybe were a little jealous of them. They wanted some of their wealth as well. Do we have any evidence that in the Middle Ages they consulted with them? Like were African Christians part of theological conversation going on in Europe in any way, shape, or form?
So again, a great question. So in the 1400s, and this, of course, Christopher Columbus' magic date is 1492. Prior to that, Ethiopians show up in Europe for two ecumenical councils, the Council of Florence and the Council of Constance. And both of those councils are prior to 1450. There's a language barrier because they know Arabic and they don't know European languages. And the Europeans, most of them at those councils didn't know Arabic. Clearly, they didn't know Amharic or other kinds of Ethiopian language. So they're there, but they have to go through translation. But they are there at both of those ecumenical councils, both the Council of Florence and the Council of Constance. The next is that there's a great interest in getting in possession some Ethiopian Christian texts. And it looks like, according to some scholars, that either from those councils, some of the, and there's only a couple of Ethiopians who are there, that they receive a copy of the Ethiopian Psalm or Psaltery, the Book of Psalms. And that becomes the first, and it's a manuscript text, and it is put within the shelves of one of the Vatican libraries. And then by 1480s, there's Ethiopians now who are there in Vatican City. And by 1500, the Pope allows for a chapel that is behind or beside St. Peter's Basilica to be used by the Ethiopians for them to celebrate their liturgy, which is in Gaze, which is their religious language. And eventually, not too long after that, there is a hostel, a guest house, a pilgrim's house that is attached to this chapel called St. Stephen's, that's attached to it, where they then are able to live. And then by the time you get to the early 1500s, there's at least a house of study that is set up there, right at this chapel of St. Stephen's, and within the hostel is there. And for Europeans who wanted to learn to read the Ethiopian Psalm in Gaze, they could come to be taught by Ethiopian scholars who would then be their teachers. And by during the 1510s, a German scholar who goes there to learn ends up having the Ethiopian Psalm or Book of Psalms. They have it printed within Rome, and it becomes the first text of an African language, the first text that is not from a European language or from Latin or from Hebrew, I should say, that is published within Europe. And this would continue, that he will go back to Germany, bring back the type, and he will also have it printed in Germany, and he'll add some other biblical texts to it. And it's the beginning of some scholars in Europe who will then study the Ethiopian version of the Bible alongside various Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, and other versions of the Bible. So this sort of, the Ethiopian Bible then is then included in these earlier collections of the Bible in order to understand how to read the Bible text, biblical text. And one of the things they're looking for is how words might be used that might help us better understand the text. And because they thought that the Ethiopian church goes back to Acts chapter 8. They thought it was one of the ancient churches and one of the first Christian languages. Now, again, just to know that historians now argue that Christianity did not begin in Ethiopia in the 1st century. It doesn't begin until the 4th century. It's not until the 300s, early 300s at that. And so therefore, it still then would be one of the earlier Christian languages, but not among the first as it was originally thought. And so that's where it gets this prestige, because it has both this antiquity to it, both as language, as they thought, and as text, and as people, and as church, and they're interacting. And there will continue to be an engagement on the Catholic side in this period. But in a few minutes, I'll be glad to answer any questions on the engagement on the Protestant side.
We're kind of walking through the Middle Ages, so we might as well get to Protestant Reformation if we get into the 1500s. So yes. You've written on that. You have an article where you talk about Martin Luther's connection to an Ethiopian Christian or a group of Christians. I forgot exactly if it's one or many.
Yes. So one, he does. So here's let me say how it came about. So again, going back to this notion of historical imagination. If I'm now saying that there is this world of Christianity prior to the rise of modern racism, and that this world of Christianity then is not seeing Africans as inferior, need of European missionary support, need of Europeans being the parents in the house, have the script where you have the European as the subject, the agent, the actor, and the African as the object, that which is acted upon, and that which is in a passive position. If that's not the script, if that's not the narrative, but if the narrative really is one of mutuality, of peership, and maybe even of emulation, the European emulation of Ethiopian Christians, then how might I find it? And so I mentioned a little bit on this larger Catholic side, with this great empire, with a mighty army, a pious king, a thriving church. And so I began to think that I'm finding all of these things on the Catholic side. The other thing that's on the Catholic side is that there's, in addition to Ethiopia being a Christian empire in Africa, there's the emergence of the Congo as a Christian empire in Africa as early as 1491. And it remains a thriving Christian empire for possibly 200 years. There's schools that are erected by 1516, over 1,000 students, boys and girls, are being educated both within some European language as well as Kikongo, which was their language. They had chapels, they had books. There's small collections of books, almost like libraries in certain places. By 1590, there's a cathedral. And when you think of cathedrals, you think, well, what would a cathedral look like, a Roman Catholic cathedral? What would it look like in an African empire in the 1500s? So is it a brick building? Is it a building of stone? And the answer is yes. Is there an organ? The answer is yes. Do they sing plain chant? The answer is yes. Do they have the Eucharist? The answer is yes. Do they read scripture? The answer is yes. And so therefore, they are seeking to be part of this large, they're not seeking, they are part of this larger Christian community, but instead of it being on the Orthodox side, as the Ethiopians were, they're on the Roman Catholic side. And the major European partner for them is Portugal. And Portugal has a different attitude towards Africans and African Christians than we will see later with the rise of modern racism. And one of the things the Portuguese did, and some other Europeans do at this time, is that nobility, nobles are nobles, nobility is nobility, blue blood is blue blood, regardless of your skin. And so therefore, the Congolese nobility meet kings of Portugal. They go to schools in Portugal. They go to the University of Lisbon, Coimbra, St. Eloy Seminary. They go to St. Jerome's College as students. And then in some other places, you have some Africans and other Congolese who serve as professors or instructors at different schools. One person now in Spain instead of Portugal occupies an endowed chair there within Granada. So therefore, things that you will not see when modern racism arises in North America and other parts of the West until maybe the 20th century, all these things are happening before modern racism. So I began to ask myself, if there is this vibrant sense of reciprocity, sense of peership, maybe even words like equality, in the midst, though, the slavery is still existing. So I don't want to make it a rosy picture. What I want to say that in spite of slavery, there's this distinction. So in a way, enslaved Africans are treated like European peasants, but African nobility are treated like European nobility. So skin color is not the marker. There are other things that are organizing. And what we would later call race is not a factor. Because whether you're an African, during modern racism, whether you're an African noble or aristocrat or an African commoner, it didn't matter. You were still oppressed. You were often still considered inferior. And in light, you could also be criminalized, and you could also be killed without cause. In this case, color is not the defining factor. What we will eventually call race is not the defining factor. It's more of class, if you want to say that, is the defining factor. And so therefore, I began to ask myself, if there's all of this activity happening on the Catholic side, if there's all of this engagement of Ethiopia on the Catholic side, could there exist an engagement of Africans before the rise of modern racism? Could it occur on the Protestant side? And if so, what did it look like? So now, that's a long way of getting to your question. So first of all, I began to search all of Luther's works that I could in English and look for any references to Ethiopia. And I found, I believe by my count, about 85 references to Ethiopia, and included in that were references to Christian Ethiopia. And in there, in the references to Christian Ethiopia, Martin Luther also follows his Catholic counterparts in the early 1500s by engaging in what I call emulation, that he respects this church. As I said before, like other educated Christians of earlier periods, he also thought that Christianity begins in Ethiopia in Acts chapter 8. So he also grants it a sense of antiquity. But the other thing he thought, that the closer you get to the church related to the birth of the church, the more authentic that church possibly is. And what he found was that what concerned him about the Catholic Church, purgatory, indulgences, communion of only one of the elements and not both, celibate clergy, scripture that was not in the local language, that he thought that the church in Ethiopia was in that case not Catholic, but actually Christian. And he applauded the fact that the church in Ethiopia was not like the Catholic Church. It did not have did not believe in purgatory. It did not practice indulgences. Clergy could get married. Communion was of the bread and wine. And they did not recognize the primacy of the Pope. And so therefore, now I must tell you that this is now moving to speculation and no longer looking at the facts alone, but there is a possibility, if we use our sanctified imagination, we could possibly assume that Luther then would say that now I know it is not my idiosyncratic reading of the Bible that's leading me to think these things that are not Roman Catholic, but it is actually a church that already has existed in his mind for 15 centuries, that also is practicing what will become Protestantism, at least on the structural, ecclesial practices elements. Clergy can get married. The Bible can be in a local language. You can have communion of bread and wine. You do not have to believe in the primacy of the Pope. You do not have to be subservient to Rome. And you can be a church then that will become Protestant, but in a way, maybe, and this is speculating, I'm not sure where scholars are going to end up on this, maybe the church in Ethiopia is a forerunner of the Protestant church that Luther and then later Calvin and others are creating.
So the Ethiopians are the original evangelicals from
you could say that. Now I'll tell you that will cause a lot of trouble, because that totally disrupts the whole ecumenical conversation.
Yeah.
Because that totally disrupts how Orthodox look at Protestants, how Protestants look at Orthodox. But yeah, you could possibly say that Luther thought that they were the original evangelicals in the sense of the ones who are claimers of the good news. I'm putting that caveat on it, what Luther thought, because we do realize now that the Bible in Ethiopia was not in a local language anymore. Like the church in Europe, it was an older language that was no longer used on a popular level. So therefore, it wasn't an everyday language anymore, just as Latin ceased to be an everyday language. So it really wasn't a vernacular Bible really anymore. But Luther didn't know that. The second thing is that he was right, though. Clergy could get married. They did have communion in both bread and wine. They didn't practice indulgences, and they didn't believe in purgatory, and they didn't recognize the primacy of the Pope. So they weren't subservient to Rome, and they didn't have to have a vow, and they didn't see Rome as what gives them legitimacy as being a Christian church. So he was right on that. So if that's true, which the documents, I should say, the basis of my argument is there are some in 1530. The base of my argument are these references that I mentioned to you of Luther mentioning this in various places within his writings. The second basis of this is that in 1534, an Ethiopian cleric, he was a deacon, his name was Michael, arrives in Wittenberg, meets Luther's colleague Philip Melanchthon, and stays there for at least some weeks, I'm not sure how many, and they have a conversation and dialogue. And after the meeting, Luther has a letter written with Luther's words. He dictates a letter to Melanchthon, which is a letter of reference. So this Ethiopian deacon who travels around places of Germany that's Protestant or that follows Luther, that he could be received, because Luther is putting, in a sense, his imprimatur on this person, on this letter, saying that this person is recognized by me as a fellow Christian. And what's striking is not only, and Luther, there's not, at least when I talk to Luther scholars, there's not thousands of letters that Luther writes of reference. I need a Luther scholar to tell me whether it's 100 or 150, but there's not thousands of them. And so this is unique that he's taking out the time to do that. The second thing is that within Luther's table talks, which are things written down by students of Luther that he does within his discourses, his talks with them. And there's references 3 years after this, where Luther is still talking about meeting this Ethiopian deacon. And he'll say 3 years ago or 4 years ago, there was an Ethiopian deacon came to town, and then he'll go ahead and talk about what's there. And so you have this very unusual situation that you have one of the founders of the Protestant movement being, in my language, enthralled by Ethiopian Christianity, possibly thinking Ethiopian Christianity is a forerunner of Protestantism, and then actually being excited about meeting this Ethiopian Christian, having a dialogue with them, having dinner with them, and then writing this letter or having this letter of recommendation written for him. And then he travels and goes out. And within Lutheranism, among Luther's successor, there will continue to be an interest in Ethiopia all the way, almost probably, through the 1600s. So this wasn't a one isolated idea, but this idea has some kind of consistency. And there's this young German scholar has now written about the engagement between Lutheranism and Ethiopian Christianity and Ethiopian Christians in the 16th and 1700s. In the 16th and 17th century. He just, I think he just defended his dissertation this spring. And so therefore, there's this sense going on. Now, you need to realize that when modern racism arises, there'll be hardly any cases where you will have a prominent Protestant leader who will have dinner with an African or a person of African descent. Will be fascinated with them as a theological person or for a theological conversation. And then write a letter of reference, almost as an imprimatur, of putting a stamp of saying, I agree with this person. And you will, I mean, I'm not sure if you know the parts of race history in this country, but the first president to have an African to the White House who's not a servant is Theodore Roosevelt. And he has Frederick Douglass there as a guest. I think he stays for dinner. There's such an outrage that he never does it again. And I think you have to get to Franklin Delano Roosevelt 30 years later before we will see it again. You also have to realize that I've been talking about Africans going to colleges and universities within Portugal, and I believe also Spain, but Portugal in particular, and graduating, and some actually being instructors and professors. But in the United States, you will not have the first college graduate until 1829. 1618, we see as the coming of the Pilgrims. 1829 is the first graduate. And that's the first. And there's at least, I think, 50 to 100 by the time you get to 1600. And you won't have a professor in a institution that will educate blacks and whites, I think, until you get like to the 1880s, and it'll be short-lived, and then it'll close. I think it's the University of South Carolina. And then, of course, when Jim Crow arises, they will get him fired because you cannot have a black person teaching at a predominantly white institution. But you could have that in Portugal for that period of time. And you also have to realize that by the time you get to the rise of modern racism, there's all these debates. Do Africans have souls? Can Africans be baptized? Do Africans have cognitive abilities to be educated? Do Africans have moral capacities? All those questions that will determine whether education can be allowed for Africans, what kind of education. There's a whole discussion in the 19th century and early 20th century. If you're going to teach people of African descent anything, it needs to be an industrial education, a vocational education. They need to learn to be farmers and carpenters. They can't learn to be poets and theologians. But there are poets and theologians already in the Ethiopian church, the Congolese church, and in Europe who are of African descent in the 1600s and the 1500s. But when modern racism comes, we erase that whole history, act like it never existed, and act like now this really is a real question. Can you educate an African? I've never seen an educated African. That's what Thomas Jefferson says when he's questioning the writing ability of Phyllis Wheatley. And so he's saying this is inferior poetry. It must be an imitation that she's doing. She can't really be creating poetry. That's the product and discussion of modern racism, calling into question the intelligence, the ability, the capacity, the moral capacity, spiritual capacity, intellectual, all of those things modern racism challenges. And we created whole systems where colleges for African Americans had to be only industrial colleges unless other people created other places, where African Americans could not be teaching white students. All of these things are products of modern racism. They did not always exist. They did not always exist in the West, and they did not always exist within the Christian church of recent vintage, meaning of the last 500 years.
Your enthusiasm for this history is great. Even on Zoom, it's coming across loud and clear. Part of what I hear you talking about is a story of how the church lost its way, perhaps. Or not to say that the church prior to 1500 was perfect, of course, but around this issue, the church lost its way, especially when the church started to get engaged in some of those debates. I believe at the beginning you talked about it was the desire to conquer the world, which is at the heart of colonialism, which then fuels the Atlantic slave trade and so on and so forth. But then the church gets called in to make judgments about hierarchy of values and who has a soul and who doesn't. And we're still, of course, paying for those sins today. The church collectively is. What does that mean going forward? It's got to be more than just remember the past, but you're telling us that the past is not just a history of failure and oppression. The past is a history of lost imagination, perhaps. Is that fair to say?
No, it is. So the first thing I would hope that any person at Westminster, any other listeners would get from our discussion today is that modern racism is an invention to justify a certain kind of form of subjugation based on race that did not exist prior to the late 1600s. So therefore, we realize that if you can construct something, you can dismantle it. That's the first thing. And this is different than patriarchy. Patriarchy, unfortunately, is not, there's a modern development of it, but patriarchy goes back millennia. That doesn't mean we don't want to move beyond it. But this is not in the same ballpark. This is a product of the last 300 years. It's not the product of the last 3,000 years or 5,000 years. So I want people to hear that this is something that comes after the rise of Protestantism. And this is something that Protestantism did not have to intertwine itself within for the sake of our traditions. The second thing would then be, if we realize that this was not with us always, and it does not have to be with us always, how do we garner the will and the imagination to collectively work towards a new world? You had mentioned that they had the desire to control the world. They didn't have a desire. They, at least on the political and economic level, controlled the world. During various points in the 19th century, there was hardly any part of the world that was not under European political and economic domination. I wish it was merely a desire, because then it could be wishful thinking. But this unfortunately took people's lives. So if we realize that now, then a congregation like Westminster, who's in a tradition, which meaning the Reformed tradition, that preceded the rise of modern racism, seemingly the challenge is to say, if we had an existence of somewhere like 180 years, maybe 200 years prior to modern racism, then we can draw from that, as well as draw from the anti-racism discussion of the present, to help create new structures at Westminster, in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and the United States. And then begin to say, what would that look like? And how do we do that? How do we show that just as there were at least 2 African bishops within the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century during the time of the Renaissance, that since we know that, then how does that fuel our imagination for who the leaders are at Westminster, in Minneapolis, and within the country? Since we know that within London, for instance, at least by my count, there's 100 Africans who were baptized as Protestants in the 1590s during the era of Queen Elizabeth I and of William Shakespeare. If you read William Shakespeare and you see an African like Othello in William Shakespeare, it's not because he imagined it. He saw them because many of the Africans, or at least some of them, lived on the west end of London, which was the theater district and still is the theater district. So William Shakespeare didn't have to imagine what an African looked like. He saw them walking down the street, and he could see them in church because their children were baptized in church, they were married in church, and their funerals were held in churches, at least 100. And so therefore, if the tradition, the Reformed tradition, the Protestant tradition, the Catholic and Orthodox tradition for that matter, if we have a tradition that precedes this, then I think that could give us both the energy to say, how do we look beyond it? So what are our equivalents to African theologians? What are our equivalents to African bishops? What are our equivalents to emulating? There's a wonderful phrase that I've seen, a hermeneutic of emulation. What does it mean to have a hermeneutic of emulation for the vital parts of African Christianity? How can we do that? How can we, like Martin Luther, one of the founders of Protestantism, learn from a form of Christianity that is different than mine, but that I would love to both appropriate some of it or borrow or learn from, but at the same time, maybe begin to see some resonances between this new thing that I'm doing, but realizing they've done it for a while, or in this case, more than a millennium. So that's part of our new posture, part of the new gestures. So I don't come in to say, how can we help out the poor Black people? No, how can we learn together? How can we now learn to relate not in racist ways, not in a system of hierarchy of races, not in a system where you value voices according to where they fit within a hierarchy of race. Unfortunately, if a person of a certain skin color says, I can't breathe, it's heard differently than a person of another skin color. Don't think I'm just talking about the police. There's medical studies that show when a Black person goes to the physician and says they're in pain, the physician, if they say, can you give us your pain level between 1 and 10? If the Black person says it's a 7, the physician already deducts some points and say it must be a 4 or 5. But when a white person goes to the physician and says, I'm in pain, the physician says, what level between 1 and 10? And if they say a 7, the physician says, it must be a 9. There's these structures of credibility, of what is heard and how it's heard, is fractured by race. So it's not merely the police officer who has a lot of learning to do. Physicians have a lot of learning to do. School teachers have a lot of learning to do. Other officials and us legislators have a lot of learning to do. There's a whole learning process because unlike Luther, unlike some of the kings of Portugal, and I don't mean they're perfect. They have their own problems, obviously. But in this regard, on this issue of dealing with Christians of a different color, they were ahead of us. And they were able to have a structure of credibility that they didn't rank people of being more credible, less credible because of their skin color. They had this, didn't have a hierarchy of cultures of saying that because you're a Congolese Christian, it must be of an inferior form of Christianity. than an Italian or German Catholic. They didn't do that. That to me is some of the things we struggle with, that we then say, what kind of world is Westminster, is Minneapolis, is United States on these issues, and how do we no longer operate within an implicit or explicit system of hierarchy of races, shaping both our communication, our understanding credibility, shaping how we relate to people.
Thank you for that tour of a way of thinking about what it means to dismantle something as pernicious or systemic, right? As racism today. This is my last thought, which I think will segue into a question, and then I'll let you go. I'm not sure we have good models for doing that in the business world, the legal world, maybe the artistic world sometimes, maybe the church world sometimes on a good day, not the educational world. I mean, so my question is about, where is the church, in your view, situated really well right now to fuel that imagination that you're talking about, of unlearning, of relearning, of understanding dignity, of understanding what it means to emulate, to recognize kinship. You called it peership as well at one point. Do you see what I mean? How is the church, as you understand the church today, right here, right now in America, situated to fuel that ways of thinking that so many of the other forces in our culture, at least I'm suggesting, are not, or at least not in the same way? Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does. It does. So let me say two things. And they're related. The first thing is, as you mentioned, one of my areas I write in is Pentecostal Studies. So in addition to talking about African Christians in the 16th century, I also write about Pentecostals in the 20th and now 21st century. And one of the fascinating elements with early Pentecostal history, meaning around 1910 or so, up until the 1930s, was that there were a group of what I call Black-led Pentecostal denominations that had white congregations as member congregations and white clergy. One of them is the Church of God in Christ. Another one is Pentecostals of the World. And there's about 5 or 6 others of varying sizes. And so again, going back to this historical imagination, what did it take for a white congregation in Mississippi or Alabama or Tennessee or California or Michigan, but especially Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama in the 1910s and 1920s to be part of a despised group, a denomination that's led by, quote, inferior people? And the privilege of race is not something that you're operating with. And they're not running these denominations. They're in secondary roles. And they're learning to worship together. They gather together. They're going against the system of racism because the society says you have to be segregated. In some cases, they're interracial congregations. And then they're going in the opposite way. They're not whites who are joining other whites. They're not engaged in a form of white religious nationalism. They're not a predominantly white denomination with a black caucus or a black subgroup. But these are whites who are part of that. So that ends. So I would probe that. The second place I might probe is that at least until 2010, there were some congregations in Europe that were part of some denominations that in particular Nigerians led. And there's a few, I think, that are part of a group that comes out of Ghana. And these white European congregations are part of these Black-led Pentecostal denominations. And sociologically, that might be something to study, to see what's their structures of credibility, what's their hermeneutics of either emulation or hermeneutics of mutuality or hermeneutics of suspicion. What's at play there? So that we can learn from what they do well and we can learn from what they don't do well. And the power of that is that the whole thrust of the second half of the 20th century is how do you fit Black people into predominantly white organizations and have Black people assimilate into those organizations and then decide which Black people you want to accept or didn't want to accept. Well, what if we flip it and say, what does it mean for white people to be in a secondary role in a Black organization and to do it voluntarily and to do it where your spiritual life is being nourished? And what does that mean? Not merely as isolated individuals, but as congregations. That's what struck me about the early 20th century with Pentecostal denominations like Church of God in Christ and Pentecostalism of the world. And that's what strikes me about 2 or 3 of these African-led denominations within Europe, that they're white congregations that are part of this. And how do we learn? And I think they will give us some insight to help us move forward in that.
Well, David Daniels, you give us a lot to think about, and I wish we had more time to talk more. I think there's a few centuries we didn't talk about. We've done a run through a lot, but I really am grateful for your knowledge and your enthusiasm and the things that I've learned from the conversation. And I'm grateful for the work you're doing at one of our Presbyterian seminaries there in Chicago at McCormick. You've worked there a long time and done great work there, and I'm grateful for that. If you're ever in Minneapolis, come by Westminster. It'd be great to.
I'd love to. And your pastor, I've known since he was in California, back in the late 80s, I believe, early 90s. And so I have great respect for him.
Tim will always talk about McCormick as the best of all the Presbyterian seminaries. He will bring that up at any time. So again, thank you so very much.
Thank you. And it's been an honor to be with you for this conversation. God bless.